The frozen world of Verath 7 had no place for humans, or so everyone believed. Dr. Alara Vance stood at her small window and watched the endless white landscape stretch toward the horizon, where twin suns hung low and pale, like dying embers in a silver sky. And she wondered for the 100th time why she had taken this assignment. 8 months she had lived here, among the Kasari, a tall and proud species, covered in silver-white fur, with eyes like molten gold. And in all that time, not one of them had spoken to her, beyond what duty required. They were wolf-like in appearance, but stood upright like humans, their bodies built for the cold that would kill Alara in minutes without her thermal suit. And they moved through the frozen streets of the mining colony with a grace that made her feel clumsy and small. She was a xenogeologist, sent to study the mineral deposits beneath the ice. And the Kasari tolerated her presence because the Galactic Council required it. But tolerance was not welcome, and Alara had learned the difference. Her habitat was a small prefabricated box on the edge of the colony, far from the warm dens where Kasari families gathered, far from the sounds of their deep voices and the laughter of their young, far from everything that might have made this frozen world feel like home. Tonight, the loneliness pressed against her chest like a physical weight, and she sat at her tiny table, staring at the ration pack the colony had provided. It was a gray cube of compressed protein, raw and cold and dense, designed for Kasari bodies that ran hot and craved meat, and the smell of it made her stomach turn. She had tried to eat these rations for the first month, forcing herself to chew and swallow while her body rebelled, and she had lost weight and strength until she knew she had to find another way. So she had smuggled supplies on the last transport ship, hiding them among her research equipment. Dried vegetables and small jars of spices that reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen on Earth, and a simple heating element that could turn raw ingredients into something warm and nourishing. Tonight, she would cook for herself. She filled a small pot with water and set it on the heating element, watching the surface begin to shimmer as warmth spread through the liquid, and already she felt better just seeing that gentle motion. Into the water went rice, and then vegetables, and then spices that released their fragrance into the air, like old friends coming to visit. And Alara closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The smell was extraordinary in this place of cold and raw meat. Curry powder and cumin and a hint of cinnamon mixed together and rose through their small habitat, slipping through the ventilation system and the gaps around her door, drifting out into the frozen evening air of Verath 7. She did not know that the smell was traveling, did not know that it was doing something that had never happened before on this world. The Kasari did not cook. In all their long history, they had never needed fire to prepare their food, for their bodies burned hot enough to digest raw meat, and their thick fur protected them from the cold that might have driven other species to seek warmth. So the concept of cooking was as alien to them as breathing water or walking on air. The smell that drifted from Alara's habitat was therefore something entirely new, something that had no name in the Kasari language, something that made those who caught it stop in their tracks and turn their golden eyes toward the small human dwelling at the edge of the colony. Most of the adults merely wrinkled their long snouts and continued on their way, dismissing the strange scent as another bizarre human thing. But 3 small figures did not continue on their way. 3 cubs, barely 6 seasons old in Kasari counting, and stared at the light glowing from Ilara's window. Their names were Keth and Yira and Soln, and they were supposed to be home before dark, but the smell had caught them and held them and would not let them go. Keth was the boldest of the 3, with darker fur than his friends, and a scar on his left ear from a tumble he had taken last winter, and he crept closer to the human habitat while his friends hung back. "What is that?" Yira whispered, her voice high and curious, her small nose twitching as she tried to understand what she was smelling. "I do not know," Keth answered, and his voice held wonder instead of fear. But I want it. Soln said nothing, because Soln rarely spoke, but his eyes were wide, and his tail wagged slowly behind him, betraying the excitement he would not put into words. Inside the habitat, Elara was unaware of her audience, as she ladled the finished curry into a bowl and sat down to eat. The first bite was heaven, after so many months of cold gray cubes, and she made a small sound of happiness as the warmth spread through her body and the familiar flavors danced across her tongue. She ate slowly, savoring every spoonful, and when the bowl was empty, she felt more like herself than she had since arriving on this frozen world. She washed her dishes and prepared for bed, and when she dimmed the lights and lay down to sleep, she did not see the three small faces pressed against her window, watching her with golden eyes full of longing. The cubs stayed there for a long time, long enough that the cold began to seep through even their thick fur, and finally Keth turned to his friends with determination in his young face. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will come back." "With what?" Ira asked. Keth thought about this, and then his eyes brightened with an idea that seemed perfectly logical to a young mind that had just discovered something wonderful. "With bowls," he said. Cubs ran home through the snow, their hearts racing with the secret they now shared. And behind them, Elara slept peacefully for the first time in months, dreaming of warm kitchens and the grandmother who had taught her to cook. She did not know that everything was about to change. She did not know that three small Kesari cubs were lying awake in their dens, thinking about warmth and strange smells and the lonely human who lived at the edge of their world. She did not know that tomorrow morning she would find three small metal bowls stacked neatly outside her door, placed there in the darkness by small paws that trembled with hope. All she knew was that cooking for herself had made her feel human again, and that was enough for now. But on Varys 7, where no one had ever cooked before, even a simple pot of curry could start a revolution, and Elara Vance was about to become something she had never expected to be. Not a scientist, or an outsider, or a lonely human, far from home. Something much more important. Something the cubs would soon have a name for. Fire Mother. The morning light was pale and cold when Elara opened her door to begin her walk to the research station, and she nearly tripped over something that should not have been there. Three small metal bowls sat stacked neatly on her doorstep, their surfaces frosted with ice crystals that sparkled in the weak sunlight. She picked them up and turned them over in her gloved hands, confused by their presence, for these were clearly Kesari eating vessels, sized for children by the look of them, and she could not imagine why anyone would leave them here. Perhaps it was a mistake, she thought, or perhaps some kind of strange Kesari custom she did not understand, or perhaps even a prank played by young ones who found the human amusing. She brought the bowls inside and set them on her table and thought no more about them as she went about her day. But that evening, when the suns had set and the temperature had dropped, and Elara stood again at her small heating element, she felt a draft stir from the direction of the door. Preparing dinner, she heard something outside her window. It was a soft sound, like snow crunching under careful feet, and when she looked up, she saw them. Three small Kesari cubs crouched in the snow just beyond her window, their golden eyes enormous in the darkness, their breath making small clouds in the frozen air. One of them clutched a metal bowl against his chest. Elara stared at them, and they stared back, and for a long moment no one moved. Then the cub with the bowl, Keth, though she did not yet know his name, raised it slightly toward her, and the gesture was so hopeful, so clearly a request, that Elara felt something shift inside her heart. She understood now why the bowls had been left at her door. She looked down at the stew she was making, a simple thing of vegetables and broth and spices, and she looked back at the three small faces watching her with such desperate hope, and she made a decision that would change everything. Opened her door. The cold rushed in like a living thing, and the cubs scrambled backward in surprise, their ears flattening against their heads, but they did not run away. "Come," Elara said, and she gestured toward the warmth inside. "Come in before you freeze." Keth was the first to move, creeping forward with his bowls still clutched tight, and Yira followed close behind him. And finally Silent Psalm brought up the rear, his tail tucked between his legs, with nervousness. They were so small, Elara realized as they entered her habitat, barely reaching her waist, even standing upright. And their fur was fluffy with youth, in a way that made her think of puppies she had known, back on Earth. She closed the door against the cold, and turned to find all three cubs staring at her heating element, with wonder in their eyes. "You make heat," Keth said, and his voice was higher than she expected. "You make it yourself." "Yes," Elara said, and she could not help but smile at his amazement. "Humans have been making heat for a very long time." "Why?" Yira asked. It was such a simple question, but Elara had to think about how to answer it in a way that would make sense to a species that had never needed fire. "Because we are not as strong as you," she said finally. "We cannot live in the cold the way Kisari can, so we learn to bring warmth with us wherever we go." The cubs considered this with serious expressions, as if she had shared some great wisdom, and Elara found herself charmed by their earnest attention. "The smell," Soln spoke for the first time, his voice barely a whisper. "What is the smell?" Elara looked at her stew, bubbling gently on the heating element, and she realized that these children had never smelled cooked food in their entire lives. "This is cooking," she said. "It is how humans prepare our food. We use heat to change it, to make it soft and warm and full of flavor." Up the ladle and scooped some stew into Kek's bowl, and the cub stared down at it as if she had handed him a bowl full of stars. "You can eat it," she said gently. "It will not hurt you." Keth looked at his friends, and they looked back at him, and then he lifted the bowl to his mouth and took a careful sip. The expression that crossed his face was something Elara would never forget. His eyes went wide, and his ears perked forward, and his tail began to wag so hard that his whole body shook, and he made a sound of pure joy that needed no translation. "It is warm," he gasped. "It is warm inside me." He took another drink, and soon the bowl was empty, and he was looking at Elara with something like worship in his golden eyes. She filled Yira's bowl next, and then Soln's, and watched as both cubs experienced the same transformation, the same wonder at discovering something their species had never known. And when the pot was empty, they sat on her floor in a small pile of fur and contentment, their bellies full and warm for the first time in their young lives. "What is your name?" Keth asked, his voice sleepy now. "Elara," she said. "Elara," he repeated, testing the strange human sounds. "I am Keth. This is Yira. This is Psalm." "Hello, Keth," Elara said, and she felt tears prick at her eyes, though she could not have explained why. "Hello, Yira. Hello, Psalm." They stayed until the warmth began to fade from their bellies, and then they gathered their bowls and went to the door. "We will come back," Keth said, and it was not a question, but a promise. "Tomorrow we will come back." "I will be here," Elara said. The cubs vanished into the darkness, and Elara closed her door and leaned against it, and laughed and cried at the same time, overwhelmed by emotions she had not felt in months. She was not alone anymore. Cubs at her window. For Keth had told his friend Mivri about the firemaker, and Mivri had come with her own bowl and her own hopeful eyes. The evening after that there were 6, and the evening after that there were 10. Elara cooked larger portions now, using more of her precious supplies, and she told herself it was fine, told herself she would find a way to get more, because she could not bear to turn away a single small face. The cubs taught her Kesari words between bites of stew. Words for warm and good and thank you and please, more. She taught them human words in return, soup and bread and dinner and friend. And one evening, when Mivri, the smallest and shyest of them all, climbed into her lap and pressed a warm furry head against her chest, she heard the cub whisper a new word. Fire, mother, Mivri said, and her voice was full of love. Ilara held the small warm body close and knew that she would never be lonely again. The colony, the adult Kesari, were beginning to notice that their cubs came home each night with warm bellies and strange new words, and soon there would be questions and trouble and judgment. But for now, in this small habitat at the edge of a frozen world, a human and a lapful of cubs sat together in the warmth, and that was enough. Word spread through the colony like fire through dry grass, which was ironic given that the Kesari had no concept of fire at all. The cubs whispered to each other in the learning halls, trading stories about the human at the edge of the settlement, about the magic she made with heat and strange powders, about the way food could become something more than just fuel for the body. They called her Fire Mother, and they spoke her name with reverence. But cubs are not good at keeping secrets, and soon the adults began to notice things that worried them. Mothers noticed that their young ones came home with bellies already full, refusing the raw meat that had sustained Kesari families for thousands of generations. Fathers noticed that their cubs spoke human words mixed in with their own language, words like soup and warm and thank you that had no place in proper Kesari speech. Elders noticed that the young ones gathered in groups and whispered about heat and cooking and a small human who smiled when she fed them, and the elders did not like what they heard. The concerns traveled upward through the pack hierarchy until they reached the ears of Clan Mother Theska, the leader of the Verat 7 colony and the most respected Kesari on the frozen world. Theska was old and strong, and had led her people through hard winters and lean years, and times when the mining quotas threatened to break them. And she had done it all by keeping to the old ways, the ways that had made the Kesari survive when other species had crumbled. She listened to the reports about the human and her cooking, and her golden eyes grew hard. On the night she chose to act, Ilara had just finished filling the last bowl for the last cub, and her small habitat was crowded with warm furry bodies and the sound of happy eating. She did not hear the door open. "What is this?" The voice was deep and cold, and cut through the warmth like a blade of ice, and every cub in the room went silent and still. Ilara turned to find herself facing a Kesari female who stood taller than any she had seen before, with silver fur streaked with white and eyes that burned with barely controlled anger. "Clan Mother Theska," Keth whispered, and his voice shook with fear. The other cubs pressed closer together, their bowls clutched against their chests, their ears flat against their skulls, and Ilara understood immediately that this was someone with great power over them all. "You," Theska said, and she pointed one clawed finger at Ilara. "You are the one who corrupts our young." "I am just feeding them," Ilara said, and she tried to keep her voice steady, even though her heart was pounding. "They were hungry, and I had food to share." "They are not hungry," Theska growled. "Kesari cubs do not starve. We provide for our own. What you do is not feeding, it is something else." "The habitat!" And the cubs scrambled out of her way, and her eyes swept over the heating element and the pots and the small jars of spices with disgust. "You teach them to need heat," Theska said. "You teach them to want things that do not exist in our world. You make them soft and weak and dependent on tricks that will not save them when the real cold comes." "I teach them that food can be more than just survival," Ilara said, and she found courage somewhere in her chest that she had not known she possessed. "I teach them that eating can be an act of love." Theska's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Love?" She repeated the word like it was poison. "Humans and their love. You live such short lives that you must squeeze emotion into everything, but we Kasari live long, and we know that softness kills, heat fails, machines break, and then, what happens to cubs who have learned to need warmth they cannot provide for themselves? Then, they remember that someone cared. Enough to try, Ilara said. They remember that food made with attention and effort tastes different than food thrown to them like scraps. They remember that they were worth the trouble. For a moment, something flickered in Theska's eyes, something that might have been doubt or might have been memory, but it vanished as quickly as it came. The cubs will not come here again, Theska declared. This is forbidden. Any cub found at the human dwelling will face punishment. This is the word of the clan mother. She turned her burning gaze on the young ones huddled in the corner. Go home, she commanded, now. The cubs fled, scrambling over each other in their hurry to escape, and their bowls clattered to the floor as they ran out into the night. Only little Mivri paused at the door, looking back at Ilara with tears streaming down her furry face, and then she too was gone. Theska remained a moment longer, staring at Ilara with cold contempt. End of P. She said, you do not belong here, you never did, and stared at her empty habitat, and wondered if she should simply give up, if she should eat the cold gray ration cubes like everyone expected, and stop pretending she could make a difference on this world that had never wanted her. And then she heard a scratch at her door. It was soft, almost too soft to hear, but Ilara's ears had become attuned to the sound of small paws in snow, and she rose and went to the door and opened it. Little Mivri stood there in the darkness, shivering not from cold, but from fear. Her small bowl clutched against her chest so tightly her claws had left marks in the metal. Mivri, Ilara breathed, you should not be here. You will get in trouble. I do not care, Mivri whispered, and her voice cracked. Fire Mother, I had to come. We have all been so cold. Cold? Ilara frowned, for Kasari did not feel cold the way humans did. What do you mean? Mivri pressed her face against Ilara's leg, and her small body shook with sobs. Cold inside, she said. Cold in here. And she placed one small paw over her heart. Ilara knelt down and gathered the small cub into her arms and held her close. And she understood then that what she had been giving the cubs was never really about the food at all. It was about being seen, being cared for, being worth someone's time and effort. It was about warmth in a world that had only ever taught them to be cold. Come inside, Ilara said, and her voice was thick with emotion. I will make you something warm. And as she closed the door against the frozen night, she knew that she would not stop, no matter what Theska said, no matter what punishment might come, because the cubs needed her, and maybe, she realized, she needed them too. The storm came without warning on a day when the twin suns had barely risen above the horizon. Ilara had lived on Verith 7 long enough to know that winter here was always harsh, but she had never seen anything like the wall of white that swept across the colony that morning, blotting out the sky and turning the world into a howling chaos of ice and wind. The temperature dropped so fast that the cold crept through her habitat walls despite the insulation, and she piled on every piece of clothing she had and huddled near her heating element, and listened to the storm scream outside. Her communication device crackled with emergency broadcasts in the Kasari language, and though she understood only half the words, she understood enough to know that something had gone terribly wrong. The colony's central heating grid had failed. For adult Kasari, this was uncomfortable but survivable. Their bodies designed to withstand cold that would kill other species in minutes. Minutes, but for the cubs it was different. Cubs had not yet developed the full density of their insulating fur, had not yet grown into bodies that could generate enough internal heat to fight off the deepest cold, and without the warming dens to shelter them, they would grow hypothermic within hours. Ilara stood at her window and watched the white chaos outside, and thought of Mivri and Keth and Yira and Soln, and all the other small faces that had crowded into her habitat night after night. Where were they now? Were they safe in their family dens? Or were they scattered across the colony, caught outside when the storm hit, slowly freezing as the cold crept into their small bodies? She could stay here where it was warm, she told herself. She could survive the storm in her insulated human habitat, with her heating element and her supplies, and no one would blame her for it. She was only human after all, fragile and small, an outsider who had never been welcome. But she thought of little Mivri, pressing her paw against her heart, and saying the words, "cold" inside, and she knew she could not hide here while cubs were dying. She began to cook. She used everything she had left, every grain of rice, and every dried vegetable, and every precious drop of spice, throwing them into the largest pot she owned, and adding water and setting it on the heating element to boil. Then she bundled herself in her thermal suit, and found the largest containers she could carry, and filled them with hot stew, sealing them tight against the cold. Then she opened her door and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit her like a physical blow, driving ice crystals into her face despite her protective mask, and for a moment she could not see anything at all, just white in every direction. But she pressed forward, guided by the faint lights of the colony, and she began to search. She found the first cubs huddled in a supply shed, 4 of them pressed together in a shivering pile. And when they saw her, they cried out in fear before recognizing her face. "Fire Mother," one of them gasped, and the hope in that voice nearly broke her heart. She poured hot stew into their bowls and watched as they drank and felt the warmth spread through their bodies, and she told them to stay here and stay together and that help would come. Then she went back out into the storm. She found more cubs sheltering in a transport vehicle, and more in the doorway of the mining headquarters, and each time she gave them warmth and told them to hold on. And each time she went back for more. Her pot ran empty, and she returned to her habitat, and made more, and went out again. The storm raged for hours, and Ilara lost track of how many trips she made, how many small faces she found, how many bowls of hot stew she poured into trembling paws. And then she saw Keth. He was struggling through the snow, toward her habitat, half carrying his friend Soln, whose eyes had gone glassy with cold. And when he saw Ilara, he cried out with relief so raw, it cut through the howling wind. "Fire Mother," he shouted, "Soln will not wake up. Fire Mother, please help him." Ilara took Soln from Keth's arms, and felt how cold the small body had become, and she ran. She burst through her door and laid Soln next to the heating element, and began to rub his limbs to restore circulation. And she heated stew and dripped it carefully into his mouth, and she held him close and gave him her own body heat through the thin fur of his chest. Keth knelt beside her, tears freezing on his face, saying please over and over like a prayer. And slowly, slowly, Soln's eyes fluttered open. "Fire Mother," he whispered, and his voice was weak but alive, and Keth collapsed against Ilara with sobs of relief. "You need to help me," Ilara said, and her voice was steady, even though her hands were brittle, shaking. "I cannot reach all the cubs alone. You need to go out and find them and bring them here." "But the clan mother said we cannot." "Forget what the clan mother said," Ilara interrupted, and there was fire in her voice now. "Your friends are freezing. Bring them to me. Tell them Fire Mother is cooking." Keth stared at her for a moment, and then he nodded and ran out into the storm. He came back with Yira and Mivri, and then he went out again and came back with more, and soon Ilara's small habitat was packed wall to wall with shivering cubs, dozens of them, huddled together for warmth, while Ilara cooked and cooked and cooked. The stew ran out, and she made porridge, and when the porridge ran out she made broth, and when the broth ran out she boiled water with the last of her spices, just to have something warm to give them. Adult Kasari began to appear at her door, drawn by the rumors and the desperation, and they stared in disbelief at the sight. Before them, a single human female surrounded by piles of their young, keeping them alive with nothing but heat and food and sheer stubborn will. Some of them tried to take their cubs home, but Ilara stopped them. "They are warmer here together," she said, and her voice left no room for argument. "They stay until the storm passes." The adults had no answer to that, for they could see with their own eyes that their cubs were alive and warm, while the colony's heating grid remained dead. And then Fesca came. The clan mother pushed through the crowd at Ilara's door and stepped inside, and her eyes swept across the habitat with an expression that Ilara could not read. Fesca's gaze found little Mivri, curled up in Ilara's lap, fast asleep, warm and safe and alive. For a long moment the clan mother did not speak. Then, slowly, she knelt down in front of Ilara. The room went silent, every cub and every adult watching in shock as the most powerful Kasari on Verath 7 lowered herself before a human. Fesca reached out and pressed her forehead against Ilara's hand, and when she spoke, her voice was soft. "You gave them warmth when the world went cold," she said. "This is not weakness." Ilara looked down at the sleeping cub in her lap, and the dozens of golden eyes, watching her with love and trust, and she smiled through her exhaustion. "No," she agreed, "it is just dinner." The storm passed after 3 days, leaving behind drifts of snow, taller than Ilara, and a colony that would never be quite the same. In the aftermath, when the heating grid was repaired and the emergency was over, the adults came to collect their cubs from Ilara's habitat, and for the first time they did not look at her with cold eyes or dismissive glances. They bowed their heads as they took their young ones home, a Kasari gesture of deep respect, and many of them spoke words of thanks in the human language their cubs had taught them. "Thank you, Fire Mother," they said, one after another, until Ilara's eyes were wet with tears she refused to let fall. When the last cub had been carried home and her habitat stood empty once more, Ilara finally allowed herself to collapse onto her sleeping mat, and she slept for 16 hours straight. She woke to the sound of construction outside her window. A team of Kasari workers had arrived and were building something onto the side of her habitat, a large structure with proper ventilation and space for many bodies. And when Ilara stepped outside to ask what was happening, she found Clan Mother Fesca standing in the snow, watching the work with her arms crossed. "What is this?" Ilara asked. "A warming hall," Fesca said, and her voice was gruff but not unkind. "Your small dwelling is not fit for feeding so many. The cubs will need more room." Ilara stared at the construction, and then at Fesca, and could not find words to speak. "I was wrong about you," Fesca continued, and the admission seemed to cost her something. "I thought you were making them weak, but you were making them strong in a way I did not understand. A Kasari who has known warmth will fight harder to protect it than one who has never known it at all." She turned to face Ilara directly, and her golden eyes held something that might have been the beginning of friendship. "You have given our people something precious," Fesca said quietly. "Cubs, something we could not give them," Fesca said. "You have shown them that survival and comfort are not enemies, that caring for someone's body is also caring for their spirit. We have no word for this in our language." "Humans call it love," Ilara said softly. Fesca considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Then perhaps it is time we learned that word," he said. The warming hall was completed within a week, a beautiful structure with proper cooking facilities and enough seating for 40 cubs at once. And on the night it opened, Ilara stood at the center of it all and cooked the largest meal she had ever made. The cubs came in waves, not sneaking through the snow anymore, but walking proudly with their parents' blessing. And they sat at the long tables and ate together, while their families watched from the doorways, with wonder in their eyes. Ilara taught the older cubs to help her, showing them how to stir pots and measure ingredients and taste for seasoning, and they took to cooking with the same fierce dedication they brought to everything. Keth became her best student, his dark fur often dusted with flour, his serious face focused on getting every recipe exactly right. Yira discovered a talent for spices, creating combinations that made even Ilara's eyes water with their intensity. Silent Soul, whose life Ilara had saved during the storm, found his voice at last through cooking, narrating his process in a quiet, steady stream that the other cubs learned to follow. And little Mivri stayed by Ilara's side through everything, her small paws always ready to help, her golden eyes always watching and learning. Years passed on Vareth 7, and the warming hall became the heart of the colony. Once a week, Ilara hosted what the cubs called the Warm Gathering, a feast that brought together Kesari from all over the settlement to share food and stories, and the simple pleasure of eating together grew into young adults, and then into adults with cubs of their own, and they carried the traditions Ilara had taught them forward into a future she had never imagined possible. New recipes emerged, combinations of human techniques and Kesari ingredients that created flavors no one had ever tasted before, and the first Kesari cookbook was written by Keth himself, with illustrations by Yira and recipes tested by Soln, and an introduction by Mivri that spoke of a human who had changed their world with nothing but a pot and a heating element and a heart full of love. Ilara's hair turned gray and her movements slowed, but she never stopped cooking, never stopped teaching, never stopped marveling at what had grown from those first 3 bowls left at her doorstep so many years ago. On the anniversary of the Great Storm, now a holiday called Warmth Day, the colony gathered in the warming hall for a special feast, and Ilara took her usual place at the center of it. All! But this year something was different. The cubs, she still called them cubs even though most of them were taller than her now, had asked her to sit down, to rest, to let them handle everything for once. Ilara protested, but Theska herself, old now but still commanding respect, told her to listen. "You have cooked for us for 30 years, Theska said. Tonight we cook for you." So Ilara sat at the head of the longest table, surrounded by golden eyes and silver fur, and faces she had known since they were small enough to fit in her lap. And she watched as her students prepared a feast in her honor. Mivri led the cooking, her movements confident and sure, and beside her worked Keth and Yira and Solm and dozens of others who had learned at Ilara's side. They made all her favorite dishes, prepared with care and love and attention to every detail, and when the food was ready they served it to her first, before anyone else. Mivri placed a bowl of stew in front of Ilara, the same recipe Ilara had taught her when she was barely tall enough to reach the counter, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Fire, Mother," Mivri said, and her voice carried through the silent hall. "Tonight we cook for you." Ilara looked down at the bowl, steam rising from its surface, and then looked up at all the faces watching her with such love that her heart felt too full to bear it. She lifted the spoon to her lips and tasted. It was perfect. Every flavor balanced, every texture right, every element combined with the skill of 30 years of learning and practice and dedication. Ilara set down her spoon and let the tears fall freely down her wrinkled cheeks, and she smiled at the sea of golden eyes surrounding her. "Perfect," she whispered. The hall erupted in cheers and howls of joy, a sound that echoed out into the frozen night and rose toward the stars, and Ilara sat at the center of it all, a human, grandmother surrounded by her Kesari family. Outside the warming hall, snow fell softly on Vareth 7, as it had for thousands of years, blanketing the world in cold, white silence. But inside, the fire burned warm. Inside, there was food and family and laughter and love. Inside, a woman who had once cooked only for herself had become the mother of a generation, the teacher of a culture, the spark that had brought warmth to a world that had never known it. She had come to this frozen planet as an outsider, tolerated but never welcome, and she had changed it forever with nothing but kindness and curry and the simple act of caring enough to share. They had thought she was fragile. They had thought she was weak. They had not understood that humans do not just survive. Humans make sure everyone else survives too. And in a warming hall on the edge of the galaxy, surrounded by the children and grandchildren of 3 cubs who had once come to her door with bowls and hope, Elara Vance, fire mother, teacher, beloved, ate the meal her family had made for her. And she was home.